So I guess what I want to start with is what characterizes research environments is essentially their open nature. So through the impetus to publish, of course, research environments encourage openness, and that sort of it basically conflicts in some ways, you might think, with commercializing opportunities. However, and that's sort of common across all research organizations. But in fact, I'm not so sure that that's the case, and I wanted to talk about an early experience that I had. In my very early career, I was a research scientist. I was a computer scientist with Bell Northern Research, which was Canada's premier research organization in telecommunications. We were both private and publicly funded. We invented the first digital switch. We were competing in the global market. We wanted to penetrate markets throughout the world, and particularly the US market. And I think the story that I'm about to tell is that certain players would like that openness to exist and for that data to be transparent because it opens up so many opportunities. And for us at that stage, my early role was as a scientist to look at the relationship between the management systems that controlled the network as well as the network. And both of those in the US, both of those industries essentially were owned by AT&T. So Lucent, as it was then known, was merged with AT&T, both the operating company and the equipment supplier. And because they owned both parts of that network, those interfaces were private, and we could never penetrate the US market very effectively because we were always stopped by the fact that we didn't work with their billing system or that we didn't work with their network management system. And so my job was to essentially understand that environment, and the proposal and the movement that I led was to open that environment up. We talked a lot, Vicky talked a lot about the opportunities for open networks. And what that did was not only allow us to compete on common ground, but a whole bunch of players enter that market and create an incredibly dynamic network that we're all talking about as the platform for the next generation of innovation. So we were able to define open languages that allowed players to come in and create services dynamically, route traffic dynamically, maintain faults in the network proactively and dynamically instead of waiting 6-12 weeks for a new service to be implemented. And imagine if you could then carry that same environment. It was essentially the first Internet of Things, was the network, the telecommunications network. And imagine if you could take that kind of openness and apply it to our road system today. So I was speaking to a founder of a startup who's working with our researchers in Wollongong a couple of recently, and she's looking at making sure that the smart city network is an open network because in Australia we have not yet opened up that network. And so we're the 21st, listening to the ABC the other day, we're the 21st most congested city in the world. And yet cities like London and Stockholm are addressing those problems by remotely managing the traffic, understanding how to manage the congestion points and rerouting traffic and charging at different rates and so on to make cities much more efficient. So it's an example of how research data can be applied in very innovative ways to create all sorts of opportunities. We spoke a little bit about, and I guess I was just going to say the other thing is the challenge for research, particularly, let's just say in CSIRO and data researchers, is languaging around that. So we invented a new language. It was very hierarchical. It was before natural language processing. It was before complex network languages. And so essentially whatever we said could happen within the network was predefined. Whereas I think the challenge now is to be open enough to allow innovation at any place in the network to use the data in innovative ways, but not predefine it so much that new innovation can't take place. Having said that, I think a lot of data is actually quite simple, and it's in, as you said, Moses, the way that it's used that is the innovative thing. And a couple of research projects come to my mind immediately at UOW. The first one is there's a wonderful project called PETA Jakarta. It's not a commercial opportunity yet, but what our researchers are doing is working with the city of Jakarta and looking at Twitter feeds. And they've also worked with Twitter, so they were one of the first people to get, first research groups to work with Twitter, to use tweets around floods. And those tweets will allow Jakarta to proactively manage flood areas using data that all of the members of the city carry around and tweet about in a very proactive way. So eventually the team wants to commercialize that. A couple of other startups that come to mind. One of a really curious one that we're working with is a company that's actually been in existence for some time. They supply hospital taps to, they supply taps, faucets, water taps to hospitals. They're reinventing themselves and working with our researchers to try and address hospital-acquired infections, which is a huge problem. And the commercial impact is extreme because those people who come into hospital for one operation end up staying 10 times as long if they get an infection. And those infections are quite commonly carried by the water in the system. So they're using the researchers that we have in our university around sensor technology, around developing algorithms to understand water flow, water temperature, but also our chemical researchers looking at how to disperse infection inside the water itself. So those are just two examples. One of our other startups is called Win-Win Parenting, and they're taking open data, which is research about how do you parent effectively. She's a researcher herself. She happens to be at UNSW as a lecturer there, but she's using her background in education research to curate all of this information around how do you parent effectively, and then selling that as a program, as an education program to corporates, and managing essentially downtime for employees based on not being able to effectively parent. So they're sort of very, very different examples. Roz Harvey is the co-founder of The Yield, which is looking at research coming out of oyster farms and remotely monitoring oyster farms and the quality of water to prevent oyster farms from having to close under certain conditions where water quality is going to destroy their oyster farm. We have another startup called Yesterday's Stories. She's a historian, and she's looking at stories that are peppered throughout Wollongong and allowing those stories to be accessed by anyone walking through the city at any one time. So if you're standing in front of a historical building, you get the story about that historical building essentially curated in a video format as you walk through the city. So you can go on and on and on. They're very, very diverse examples of how data can be used, both research data and married to the most mundane data, and provide really innovative opportunities.